Good afternoon, everyone. It's wonderful to be with you all for yet another reInvent. My name is Andrew Midgley, and I feel privileged to be able to share with you some of the things I've learned from this community over the last 9 years working on Cloudability. Today, I'm joined by two experts that have been involved with the FinOps movement from the very early days. Two people I've had the pleasure of working closely with on this journey.
G'day, and thank you, Midge. It's also a real pleasure to be here and talk to you guys about Shift Left and FinOps in general. I'm Adam McDonald. I'm the founder and co-founder and director of FinOps SME at Cloudic, short for Cloud Economics. And we're a FinOps-focused organisation based in Australia, and we just do FinOps. My quick background, I'll try to be quick, the short version. I worked at Qantas for a long time, 8 years. You may have heard of them, a little airline based in Australia. I was started in the infrastructure team back in 2014. And that same team was the same team responsible to build a opinionated AWS pipeline cloud platform for all applications. Excuse me. That platform included guardrails, an opinionated pipeline, as I mentioned, with great allocations to tags and tagging of applications to business units. I found myself moving into AWS certifications and becoming a senior cloud platform engineer very quickly. And why I found FinOps so interesting back then was it was often the canary in the mine shaft. It was the canary in the mine shaft scenario, which was often cost. So for instance, some applications were running, stood up 2 or 3 environments and hadn't stood them down. Or even a cyber issue came up once or twice in the past. And this was all highlighted by FinOps. I quickly became the escalation point for all C-level execs and finance and procurement, etc., to explain the perceived extra costs associated with cloud. I did this by being able to show where the spends were, justify the deficit from the data center migrations into the cloud, and able to overcome the reactive halting of these projects and data center migrations that happened along the way. Ultimately, I gained the trust of finance, and that I was able to show where the applications were allocated and being spent, and not just that, rolling it up into the business units, cost centers, and allocations, so that the invoice can be paid, but the understanding of where all the workloads were was understood. So 2 years ago, founded Cloudic. Now my team and I work across many of Australia's largest and most iconic brands. And we help them with maturity assessments in an organisation that help pick up their shortfalls in FinOps. But we primarily do professional managed services solely around FinOps. Rob.
Okay. Welcome, everybody. I'm Rob Martin. I'm a FinOps principal at the FinOps Foundation. And I started my illustrious career there 3 years ago after a more illustrious career at Accenture and the federal government. I've been doing FinOps since 2019 when the FinOps Foundation started, and have been involved in helping a bunch of teams, a bunch of companies stand up their FinOps practice and learn how to optimize their cloud. And so we're happy to talk to you about that today.
Awesome, thanks, Rob. So what is the overarching context for this presentation? Put simply, there's an awful amount of waste and inefficiency in our cloud deployments. Across analysts, a typical stat you'll see published is that up to 30% of cloud spend is wasted. With annual global cloud spend now well over $500 billion, this waste amounts to a huge sum in overspend. So, as public cloud becomes a bigger component of our supply chains, we owe it to our employers to improve our efficiency. And for many of us, competitive pressure in the marketplace will leave us little choice. So my goal today is that you can walk away from this session with a firm understanding of what it means to shift left, the benefits this can bring, and some ideas to make optimization more proactive at your organisation. So what will we cover today? To kick things off, I'll get Rob to describe the FinOps lifecycle, the FinOps phases, and where optimization fits in. Rob and Adam will review highlights from the State of FinOps report and what the community is saying about optimization. Shift left is a relatively new concept within FinOps, so I'll spend some time looking at what inspired it. Adam will then discuss what it means to have an optimized state. What are we even trying to achieve in the first place? We'll then explore the 4 stages of shifting left, at each stage becoming less reactive and more proactive. And to finish up, we'll look at the impact of organisational silos, commitments, sustainability, and how we can wrap everything up with unit economics. With that, Rob, I'll get you to talk about FinOps.
Okay, thank you. So first, I'd like to poll the room a little bit. Who in the room is doing FinOps in some regard? Look at that. All right, we can just skip this slide then.
Yeah.
Let's just
Skip.
on to the next thing. Thank you all for doing this. A couple years ago, that would have been like 2 or 3 people. So very excited that almost everybody in the room is related to or doing FinOps in some way. Of course, optimization is an important part of every FinOps practice, right? Why? Because when we start to use public cloud, unlike data centers, there is an unlimited smorgasbord of crab legs that we pay for by the pound, and right, our engineers are going out and using that stuff every day. When I worked at the Department of Justice, nobody ever snuck into my data center and installed 50,000 new computers over the weekend. But that, unfortunately, that sort of thing happens in the cloud sometimes. So optimization is built in a couple different key places in our FinOps framework. It's built into the different phases that we do. We practice FinOps in a cyclical, repeatable, iterative fashion. So you see the inform, optimize, and operate phases of a FinOps practice. Optimize is almost always something that we're doing it's always something we're doing in a consistent and continuous way. And it's built into the domains that you see on the right-hand side. Understanding our cost, tying that cost, what we're spending in cloud or what we're spending on IT, back to the value that our organization is getting, is then bolstered by the optimization step where we want to see if we're paying the right amount for the things that we're using and we're only using the things that we need. Right? That's all what we're doing in the optimize phase. And we're seeing organizations doing that not just for cloud, but also for their SaaS products and their licenses and even their on-premises databases, data centers, and private clouds. So those domains are kind of the things that every organization should be looking to do. They're the outcomes that we're really looking for: understanding, tying to value, optimizing, and managing an effective practice. Thank you. The FinOps doing those things and building that optimization into what you're doing is really all about making decisions, though. And so you see on the right-hand side the FinOps definition. The FinOps is an operational framework, but it's also a cultural practice of getting cost awareness and cost accountability baked into your organizations. So that your engineers and your product leaders, all the people on the left-hand side who are involved in that FinOps, who are involved in getting value out of cloud and out of your IT spending, are able to make those decisions collaboratively. They're able to make those decisions with good data, and they're able to make those decisions as early as possible. And that's one of the key themes we're going to talk about in today's session. So I wanted to share a little bit of data about that we're getting from the FinOps community. The FinOps community is almost 25,000 people strong right now. We're in our FinOps group. If you're not a member of the FinOps community, I would welcome you to go out to the FinOps.org website and join, get involved in some of our activities. As a personal favor, I would love for you to go to data.finops.org. I'd like you to pull out your phones right now and type data.finops.org. Then I'd like you to put your phone back in your pocket and listen to us for the next 30 minutes. But that is going to be the State of FinOps survey, and that is where we get a lot of these results from. So if you want to participate in this community, if you're doing FinOps in your organization, please share how you're doing that with the rest of us. But as you can see, that challenge of optimizing, the challenge of getting our organizations to take action is a constant battle. For the last 3 years of the 5 years we've been doing this, we've seen one of the top challenges is getting engineers to optimize, getting engineers to reduce waste, getting product teams and everyone else to take action to really keep our costs down. And we're seeing that in a lot of places. I'm sure you're seeing it as well.
Yeah, so I find it really interesting that in those 3 years that you can see on screen that they've changed positions every time. I think as FinOps has become a thing, the number one there is reducing waste, and that is what every organisation, CIOs, executive leaders want to see is costs coming out of the business, and the direct result is saving money. But I'm with Rob there. It looks like engineers has fallen down the list, but I think you had more respondents as a reason for it being there. My biggest challenge and what I see in Australia is it is the hardest thing to do, is to get engineers to take action. And engineers like to focus on new product, new ideas, and not work on old pre-existing BAU legacy workloads. FinOps is often deprioritised for new products, so it's massively consistent across all organisations I see.
Yeah.
Yep.
And I want to be really clear. It's not engineers are doing a bad thing.
No.
Or engineers are being bad people. It's really, I think, a lot of times a visibility problem too. If engineering teams don't have the visibility to the data,
Yep.
They can't make those changes. And so bringing it all together into that cycle.
Yep. But one way or another, like waste and inefficiency so far, well, at least for the last 3 years, has been number one.
Yep.
So maybe maybe after this State of FinOps report, or in a couple of years' time, maybe that'll change. But
After all of you take this action.
after there you go. All right, so I'm just going to spend a little bit of time talking about the origins and goals of shifting left. And I'm actually going to start with an admission that until fairly recently, I'd actually never heard of shifting left or shift left. And I'm sure it's a newish concept to at least some of you. So with that in mind, I thought it worthwhile investigating where this concept came from and what it was looking to solve. So as it turns out, the FinOps adopted this concept from the DevSecOps community. And their goal was to push security and defect elimination earlier in the development process. And by doing this, they can prevent issues occurring in the first place, which will reduce effort and of course, reduce costs. So another way that we could frame this is that it's about building quality in. That's what the focus is. Now, if you're in the medical industry, you could frame it a different way. You could say that prevention is better than a cure. So the value of shifting left is captured very nicely in this chart, which will be familiar to many software testers. In a previous professional life, I worked as a software tester, and this was the visual they used in training materials to try and convince us of the need to be involved earlier. The point it is making is that if we can eliminate defects earlier in the software development lifecycle, we can dramatically reduce their impact. So we all suspect that there's a similar pattern that applies to resolving cloud waste. And I don't think we have any data yet. Maybe that's a job for the foundation in the years ahead.
Could be.
But it might turn out to be that waste that has made its way all the way to production might turn out to be 30 times more costly. So yeah, there's the context behind shift left, adopted from the DevSecOps community. We want to resolve waste as early as we can. So that's the history. And I'll hand over to you, Adam, to talk about what an optimized state is.
Yeah, cool, thank you. So I find that these are very self-explanatory, so I'll try to get through them quickly. And if there's a lot of hands that say they're running FinOps, understand FinOps, then this, to be honest, should be fairly self-explanatory. So well-sized VMs, databases, disks, and containers. So as the picture indicates, more often than not, a lot of organisations have oversized and over-provisioned the resources bigger than required. So whether it's EC2 RDS, or if CPU is utilised effectively, or memory, indications or metrics are suggesting memory or RAM is greater than necessary. Another great example I see is block storage over-provisioned as IO1. Far too many IOPS that just aren't being used. And so often a quick win with that is to have a look into it and slip it back to a GP3 as a specific example. Note this process of resizing services lends itself to modernisation options or process. So you've got some M4s and you could start looking at M6s and 7s. Which obviously leads to greater performance and cheaper costs. We talk about this a little bit later. The second one, no idle EC2, RDS, EBS, and S3, DBs, and containers. Just going to say off the block, if it's unattached, turn it off, get rid of it, remove it. I've seen automation help with this over time, and it's really, really handy. Well-written scripts, to retire anything unattached after X amount of days, 30, 60, 90. Great outcomes and little risk. Well-placed containers. A well-optimized state is going to include unique challenge of balancing workloads across the nodes, EC2 in the case of AWS, for each cluster. You don't want a situation where the nodes and resources are constrained and suffering performance issues while others are barely used. Dev test. This one's kind of my favourite. A really quick wins to enforce right timing or shutdowns overnight and weekends. So if you can imagine 30% of your workloads are dev and test, and that you could shut them down 50% of the time, some really great outcomes there, and should be a no-brainer. So dynamic scaling of infrastructure and platform as a service. I think also speaks to itself. The core takeaway is managing application, quality as a service, so availability, scaling, performance, and throughput to meet the dynamic business demands. The obvious benefit is the service usage. As the service usage is low, the service is ramped down and thus saving money in a more optimized state. The cloud native and modern applications. So a lot of companies look to, if you can,
Oh, sorry.
yeah, there. A lot of organisations look to modernise applications that are either on-prem into cloud or new apps, and often they look at approach of SaaS first, and I tend to agree with that. But if not, they quite look to re-architect the old app in a modern way. Many organisations have taken the steps towards services like Lambda to achieve this with a better result, and for want of a better word, using old school servers in EC2. Often Lambda gives a much better result, but fraught with danger. I've actually seen some poorly implemented Lambdas using hundreds of functions and costing more in the end, and it would have been better off with an EC2. So the outcome of that is that just experienced cloud architects are required upfront to make the right decisions, and some of this we'll explore in Shift Left as we go.
Yeah,
Rob,
I think this
you've
is
got
going to
something
be.
to add to this one.
Yeah, as we're going through this, you'll see that a lot of these optimized state things, this is what you should be striving for, right, in any environment, is to get to an optimized state where you feel like you're using the things that you are running and you're paying the least amount for those things that you are running that you know you need. And as you get this is sort of the engineering view of this, and it's an important aspect to get to. But I think as we go into the rest of the conversation here, we also want to think a little bit more holistically or more strategically about the systems that we're optimizing, right? Does this system need to be in the cloud in the first place? Could be a provocative question. Or does this, at a cloud conference, does this system need to be developed the way that it is in the vein of cloud native and modern applications? Could we use a SaaS product in place of that? Could we use a different database model? Could we use a more managed service as an alternative to do that? And sometimes we've got the levers to pull for that, and sometimes we don't. But we're always making sort of the trade-offs between optimizing, like, am I optimizing to achieve speed, to achieve quality, to achieve cost goals, that sort of iron triangle of fast, cheap, and good that we're always trying to balance as we make these decisions. These are really the engineering technical parts of it, but we really want to try to push that as far back and become more proactive as we go. And I think we'll talk about that in the next section.
Yeah, so I think to summarize what you're saying, it's almost like the optimized state is going to be different for every organization,
Yes. Yep.
depending on the constraints and incentives they've got.
Yeah, and every type of application. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, that was good, sorry. All right, so off to you, Mako, to talk about the first stage of shifting left.
Yeah, okay, so starting with ownership. I've come into loads of organisations at various levels of maturity, some ranging from 90% to 100% tagging and some with zero at all. The best organisations I've seen have just used tagging with very few keys, tag keys, those being the tags that don't change often or at all. So like an application or a product doesn't change, an environment, dev, test, prod, doesn't change. And this is, so often my favourite is a unique identifier, an application ID, a product ID, often a code. Organisations get the tagging for those things just right and not so much for the other. What did I get to? So org structures and cost centres and business units, they can all change over time. And so that metadata could be held elsewhere, not just as a tag in the cloud. And that's where you can use the metadata for who's accountable, responsible, and getting the workloads and costs shown into their area. Third-party tools like cost categories or third-party tools or cost categories in AWS can assist where tagging is poor. The outcome is aiming for 100%. Once this is alignment to the business is understood, we can move to hone into more specific app or product and quantify waste and opportunity specifically for the app or the product. Take, for instance, the oversized EC2 RDS. I've used this nice tool on the screen there, so it's a blatant plug to our partner here today, and filtered down to the app level, so it's only showing you a very specific application, and to assist in identifying where there's potentially oversized resources, and of course the biggest savings, sorted by the biggest savings. It's very handy to use with your engineering teams. What you see here is CPU, storage, memory, and IOPS, utilisation metrics at an individual resource level. This level of information really assists when you want to go down to the engineering teams and have the conversations, and you can then also know who's accountable and responsible for those workloads. Just to note, recommendations are just that. They're just recommendations. Any and all adjustments, to my mind, in cloud need the developers or engineers to pay attention to the specific application architectures, the patterns, and the use case. That's the next one. Unattached EBS volumes. When idle 100% of the time, it's obvious to highlight and work with the engineers to rectify, terminate, and/or automate. S3 buckets with no lifecycle policy. S3 buckets, they continue to grow and grow and grow, and I've seen it time and time again. It's very common. Often tools recommend tiering and just applying tiering to the storage. But I think the better solution there is where you identify through the tooling, but look at it at a deeper level using something like S3 Lens, and work out what you're storing and why, more importantly than just applying tiering over the top. Again, a consultative approach with the engineers. Completely idle resources, as I mentioned above, they're just not needed and shouldn't be added as extra spend. As mentioned, there can and should be automation for termination. And last and not least on this slide, old and expensive resource types. For instance, GP2 is almost a no-brainer to GP3. And this is always one of the first recommendations we'd look at and give. And I think that's very common. But at CloudAC, we also provide graphs and reports on a monthly report to track the legacy things like EC2 and RDS over time. And customers love to watch the graphs over time as the newer instances are rising and the older instances are falling away. There's up to, say, 20% savings that's available by doing just that modernisation process in itself. And while you're looking at that, doing the modernisation of your generations, get the icing on the cake and go with Graviton if you can. Yeah.
Thanks, Adam. Okay, so far, you've outlined a very important foundational step, and that is we require a means to identify existing waste and a means to tie it to those who are responsible. Absolutely crucial. At that point, ideally, there are insights available, similar to what you showed, that the teams can then start using to start addressing that waste. So that brings us to stage 2, which you can see is a little bit more proactive. So at stage 2, we're focused on institutionalizing those insights and implementing policies to make sure that actions do actually happen. So Rob and Adam, I know you've both had recent experiences with customers on this front. So I'd love to get some feedback on what's been working and maybe what hasn't been working, if that happens to be the case.
Yeah. You first?
Okay.
Okay, so we've actually done this by implementing actions via Jira tickets. The initial feedback was absolute complaints and backlash. They were not happy with it at all. But as time went on, it became part of their routine and part of their daily workloads. So once the Jira ticket was in the queue, it just doesn't disappear. So something's going to get done. It helped out that the organisations that I've worked with have really good C-level commitment to savings, and the messages were from above are important, so engineers were getting that message through. So as more and more engineers were taking on the work in their daily queues, the rest who were reluctant to fall into line with this, it became as part of their BAU. It's almost gamification, but no one wants to be seen dragging the chain on this. The culture change is difficult, but they got there in the end, in multiple cases and scenarios I've seen. And this happens, and this to note, that happened without additional budget needing to be set up in the organisation to kick off a separate body of work. It became part of their life.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of similar activities in the community, right, that are presenting this. A number of our working groups have worked on gamification in particular as an exercise to do that. AWS has something called a FinHack, which is a great fun activity that can be free where they can come out and help engineering teams interact with finance teams and with FinOps teams and CFM teams to get that hands-on experience about how do we look at this, how do we look at the cost of things, how do we build that into our own workflows. We talk about this in the FinOps framework in terms of putting data into the path of all the different personas and putting data into the path of engineers so that they can plan it into their DevOps cycle, so that they can plan it into their next backlog, so they can put it in their backlog and plan it into their next sprints. That's an exercise that engineers are entirely comfortable doing, as opposed to showing up at an engineer's desk with a pile of recommendations that you think that they ought to do to fix the cost profile of their application. So really getting any opportunity to break down those silos and get that data in front of engineers so that they can be aware and take the action that's appropriate for them in the time that they've got available.
Perfect. Okay, so that brings us to stage 3. So until now, we've been improving how we deal with existing waste and minimizing its impact. Now it's time to make the leap and become proactive. How do we prevent waste accumulating in the first place? Well, the answer is we need to get insights and guardrails in front of engineers before they deploy their infrastructure. This can take a number of forms, but at Cloudability, we like the approach of integrating with GitOps pipelines, like your CI/CD pipelines, and leveraging existing infrastructure as code. And that's the philosophy behind our new feature up there, which is called Cloudability Cost Guard. So again, Rob and Adam, I'd love to get your insights on what you're seeing having the most impact in trying to take that. This is the first time we're actually going from being reactive to actually genuinely getting proactive. So what are you seeing sort of have the most impact?
Yeah, really being proactive. I think that we're seeing this happening in more mature organizations, certainly around the world. We just finished our FinOps X conference in Europe, in Barcelona last month, and so this was something that was presented there. Warner Hotels, as an example, presented on their CI/CD integration, which was not only checking all of the boxes for how they would like to, the guardrails they would like to put on their infrastructure, but was also using a small AI component to compare what was being launched to other code and other infrastructure that they had launched in the past. So it was able to spot like anomalous behavior or anomalous usage of different resources and different architectural models even before it was going to production, in addition to sort of estimating cost at that time. So I think this is a really important area where organizations can get very mature very quickly.
Yeah, so a lot of the organisations, and the best ones that I walk in and out of, application and infrastructure as code, as usually run through some sort of pipeline and repositories. And the better outcomes later in time are very obvious to me, as opposed to those that either did a lift and shift and didn't have any configurations, enforced tagging where possible, and enforced guardrails. Another thing that I've seen, which was really nice add in this sort of light, was that one of the customers used a cloud console for the developers and the engineers and the application teams. It's kind of like their one-stop shop to run their deployments. There was no access to AWS. It was the focal point for all the developers and engineers. As time went by, they added more and more modules, but they got one in there that I hadn't seen before, which is API-driven with the cloud spends. So not only were they logging into their portal for their responsibility of the apps that came from the CMDB and the lineup of the mappings we talked about earlier, but they could just see the costs front and centre for where they spent their time. And I thought and found that being one of the most valuable and mature places I'd actually come across.
That's really cool.
Yeah.
We were actually hearing, even in discussions yesterday, like a lot more of I think as cloud is becoming, sort of the predominant way that that a lot of operations are developing software and developing value for their customers. Those cloud operations teams are reintegrating with traditional operations teams that had been running data centers, that had been managing on-premises infrastructure before in large enterprise customers who are still managing a big hybrid infrastructure. So I think that platform engineering team has been the source of a lot of that kind of governance and putting together those kinds of portals. And we're hearing more and more that FinOps is working with those types of teams to get that in place.
Awesome. Yeah, it definitely feels to me like at this point, we're breaking some new ground.
Yeah.
Like I've not seen too many organizations really kick butt at this. So I think if we come back in 12 months' time, like some of these approaches will start maturing, and
100%.
Maybe we can present on it again next year, maybe. Awesome. So that was stage 3. We are getting proactive. We're getting our insights. We're getting our guardrails in front of our engineers where we can before they deploy their infrastructure. So now we're going to take another step and become even more proactive. And I know, Rob, you're the especially experienced one here.
And I'll push the envelope for you. And this is what we're seeing in the most mature organizations in the world, the organizations that have already begun to integrate together their FinOps operations, their FinOps practices with their on-prem services and SaaS management and all of the different parts that are looking at the financial impact of what they're spending on the value they're creating across the board. Because as we're making those decisions, more strategic, bigger decisions about what we're building and what we're using and how we're operating it, and what our margins are, we're having to do that across a wider variety of platforms, right? I may need to decide between running something in a data center, running something in cloud, or which type of cloud architecture I would want to use an application for. So I've got to have that purview to be able to make those informed decisions. And we're seeing that organizations are getting spoiled by having the granular data that the FinOps platform can provide about the cloud. The granular data of cloud is a challenge for the FinOps team, but it's also a source of really good information to make good data-driven decisions. And so the more that we can gather that same kind of information for our licenses and for our SaaS use and for our on-prem data centers, the better decisions that we can make overall. So in doing this more proactively and trying to drive this even further left in the process, what we're seeing is more organizations moving beyond just fixing things after applications have been built to trying to do things more during the building process, or even getting engaged with FinOps teams at the beginning of building process. So we've got a wider variety of decisions that we can make together to make that cost profile even better. And in the biggest sense, we're also seeing big organizations moving those decisions further back into the product development process as well. So we're trying to make decisions about, should we even be building this product in the first place? We've had some members who've talked about building applications, building services for their customers that they got out into the marketplace, tried to optimize and never could get to a profitability, and then having to cancel those later. It may have been a better decision to understand what the cost profile of that application needed to be from the very beginning, so that we could have made a different decision and used our resources elsewhere to do that. So we really want to try to drive that decision making as early in the process as we can, to get the biggest value and get the widest variety of decisions that we can make.
Yeah, I think one thing I find sort of slightly humorous out of that is that by having that cost-aware product decision, like you're saying, it might mean you actually don't even build that thing in the first place. Yeah. And that, that seems kind of bizarre, but I mean, how many scenarios are there out there where you build something and the value's not there and it's too costly? So.
And think of what you could have done with that time and all the resources you put into that. Yeah,
exactly. I'm sure people have experienced those kind of things before. So yeah, so we've gone really proactive at this point, to the point of project, product inception, and making decisions there. So that's fantastic. So what we're going to do now is have a few different areas we're going to talk about that are considerations that you want to take into account when you are shifting left. And so the first one I'm going to start with is you, Rob, talking about silos.
Yeah. So this is going to revisit a lot of what I was just talking about. What you're seeing on the screen here is a summarized version of something we presented at our last FinOps X conference. If you look at our YouTube video, there's a better version of this diagram up there. But in essence, if you think about an application, if you think about developing any application, you're going to follow that kind of gray line as you develop, right? You're adding new resources, you're starting new environments, you're increasing the cost generally as things go, and you're making decisions in that design phase there of what kind of system do we want to build, what kind of value do we want it to create for our customers, how do we want to architect it, and as you move into the build cycle, you're getting engineering engaged, and you're starting to say, how am I going to build that? Which databases am I going to use? Which environment am I going to put it in? You're making a lot of decisions that are going to ultimately impact the cost of what you're building, and ultimately impact the value it's going to create. And once you get into the operate phase, that's where finance comes in. They suddenly see the bill, and suddenly there's a big discussion. The metaphorical fourth quarter comes around, and we're having to adjust what the cost profile of that application is. We can't have that cost just continue to rise, so we start to do the reactive things that we talked about. We start to come in and buy some RIs, and we start to turn off some things that are idle and right-size some of our instances and do those things. And that allows us to turn that cost curve down a little bit. So you see that purple line representing the way that the FinOps team applied at the end of a build process can really impact the cost profile of an application. But if we get them involved much earlier at the beginning of the build process, we can be involved, FinOps teams can be involved in helping to understand and explain and get everybody else involved in deciding how we ought to be building things, how we ought to be putting those things together, and which options we should choose. Again, using that iron triangle of cheap, good, and fast to figure out how we should build this thing. We've got many more choices to make in that case about architecture, about product selection, about location selection. But if we move that all the way back to the beginning of our design process and keep in mind what we're going to have to pay at the end, all the way up at the beginning, we've got an opportunity to make an even bigger impact, right? To make some of those go, no-go decisions, to decide what the unit economic profile of this thing is. It would be really nice to be able to go to the engineering team and say, we need to build this thing and it needs to come out at $250 per click, right? If I can give people a cost goal and some structure around that decision, I'm able to get like a much more effective, I'm able to give guardrails to the engineering team that they can use in their daily practice, not just sort of service and platform guardrails that they can use. So this helps to spread the word around. It helps everyone to collaborate on building a solution that we know is going to be successful and we know is going to be valuable to our customers at the end. And it gives us much more opportunity to lower the cost curve of applications overall.
Awesome. Adam?
100%, starting at the design, cost-aware product decisions is where to be. But what I'm finding, I'm walking into organisations that are already the purple line, the epitome of that purple line. And their data centers migrations are over, but their spends are so large that there's a real justification piece here on doing a good body of work on all of those right shifting left options to start not just optimizing and getting the quick wins, the sugar hit, saving some money, because the patterns will come back again. But getting back to the design of these applications with the right information and getting those engineers to start thinking about the modern ways of building. What does this application, to what Warren was saying, does this application or this product, it actually serves this amount of cost and effort to maintain, but it's only delivering this amount. What does it need to be? What could it look like?
Yeah.
And that's a really valuable thing. So I deal with a lot of customers in the purple operate area, but coming back to the blue and the design, the build and the design is really important. And particularly in very large spends, it's well worth the effort.
Awesome. Yeah, and I think just to wrap that one up, this slide up, like I do encourage people to go to the FinOps Foundation website, because I know you've got a much more detailed sort of analysis of this, so I think it's really cool.
I mean, to the point of the slide, this sounds really simple, right? Just move back and start working with the CEO about what new products you're going to launch. This is all about breaking down the silos. And so the collaboration of getting to be able to figure out how to work with the product teams and getting to be able to work with the engineering teams is really key to success in this area.
Awesome. Cool. So another consideration when shifting left is your commitment strategy. Now, I remember a time in the past where practitioners felt quite constrained when selecting things like instance families and other options, nervous that those decisions could end up moving away from existing commitments. So the good news is that most people we talk to are now relying on compute savings plans. And the good thing about these are that the benefits naturally flow between regions, between instance families, and even between services. So the good news is we have more freedom to just simply deploy what makes the most sense. So for example, if we move from a compute-optimized instance to a memory-optimized instance, because that just makes more sense, there's very little risk that we're going to leave unused commitments behind us. So yeah, in terms of commitment strategy at that kind of granular level, we certainly have much more freedom. So Adam, I know you've got experience sort of at the higher level what some of the impacts can be.
Yeah, so for instance, first thing to do is do some of the optimizations and shift left before really committing. If you've got a high commitment level, then go for a little bit, but save it for after the workloads have been fixed, for want of a better word. Also, you need to understand and work with your project manager office or program manager office or equivalent function to understand what projects and new workloads are coming into the cloud. That's often very hard to get out of organisations. Obviously, work with finance to agree on what you're wanting to commit to as well. But as I call it, layer the cake. So smaller commitments more often. It reduces the risk of overcommit and potential waste if more optimization gets done later. And also consider splitting the commit. It's a lot safer now with the savings plans, as Midge mentioned, let's say you have a headroom of $20 per hour. Why not split, and you're looking for that golden 80-90% coverage that everyone's liking to chase. Why not split it into two, a 3-year and a 1-year, so two $10 commitments. And what you do by doing these smaller ones more often, you get a baseline of 3-year commits, and the return on that is so much more valuable than just having a 1-year commit for a longer period of time. So yeah, there's little to no risk if your business strategy is to stay with Amazon. So yeah, I recommend to customers quite often split it, make it a common sense decision, but a 3-year will yield a much higher return than a 1-year.
Yeah. So in summary, do not let your commitment strategy get in the way of shifting left.
No.
It should not get in the way.
No, absolutely not.
Awesome. So can sustainability be shifted left? That's a question. And of course, the answer is yes. so far we've been talking about the cost, the financial cost of cloud consumption, whereas sustainability is focused on the environmental cost of cloud consumption. As always, the key is going to be getting the right metrics in front of engineers at the right time. So in this case, obviously there are different types of metrics. We're not looking at cost, but we're going to look at things like power consumption and carbon emissions. Now, the good news is that tools like Cloudability, we are able to report at a very granular level on how much carbon is emitted associated with your AWS infrastructure. And we can do that all the way down to the individual resource level. So if you'd like to know what an EC2 instances cost in terms of carbon, you can do that quite simply. So if I could summarize this, if sustainability is important to you, you absolutely should shift it left. It's just about getting the right metrics in front of your engineers at the right time.
Yeah, these are some of the decisions that are really hard to undo if you're trying to address them after the fact as well, after building. So important considerations to have going in to this, but also challenging to get all the data sometimes to make those decisions early on in the process.
Yeah. Cool. All right, good. So I think we're doing well for time here. Nope. So a couple of thoughts as we wrap this up. So far we've been talking, about moving ourselves left so we can be more optimized, be more efficient, get rid of waste. And that's fantastic, and I'm sure we're going to have very good ways of measuring that. For example, we can just simply track what our applications are costing over time. Or we could have some other kind of efficiency metric that we might like to use. But these metrics, they can be a little bit esoteric, not particularly business-facing. So what we want to do is we want to try and raise that up and try and get some metrics out that the business fully understands. And this is where unit economics really does play a big role. So the screenshot here, it's a little bit dated. It's actually from Cloudability, but it's a good example. So I'll just kind of walk through it very briefly. So for us, what was the most important thing as a part of serving our customers was processing billing data from Amazon and the other cloud providers. So at one point in time, we were doing very well as a business. We were signing lots of customers. We thought we were getting more efficient, but of course, our total application costs were going up. And in particular, the cost of ingesting all this billing data. So we knew we needed to be more efficient. We knew we needed to reduce costs. But we wanted to do it in a way that was smart. So the way we did that, we did it through unit economics. And so what we did was we said, okay, for these cost pipelines where we're ingesting data from our customers, what is the cost per billion lines of cost data? And we got a measurement on that. Just trying to read what we had. So originally it was about $22 we were paying per billion lines. And then over time, we were able to, by doing a few of these things that we saw here, probably not shifting left exactly, well, we were shifting left, but not fully proactive, but doing some of these things, we were able to be more efficient and get that cost per line, per billion lines down a lot. Now, over time, our total cost of the application actually started going up again, and that was a concern. But the good news was we were still efficient. Our unit economics was telling us that our cost per billion lines was actually still stable or going down. So it was a really good metric for us to use that irrelevant of business activity, we were able to measure efficiency and the business could kind of understand it. So that for us was just an example. That was the unit economics story that made sense for Cloudability. But of course, every business is going to be different, particularly if you're consumer facing or if you're B2B, you have to really think about what that metric is. But yeah, as a part of this journey of shifting left, I would highly encourage everyone to think of that business metric and then track it over time.
And really try to push that unit economic as left as possible as well, right? If you're on a FinOps team or even if you're on an engineering team, try to ask what is the unit economic we want for this, right? Unit economics, I always summarize, there was a great book written by a guy named Hans Rosling, who was an anthropologist and doctor. He's since passed away, but in his book, Factfulness, which is a great book to read because it makes you feel good about humans, which is kind of hard these days. In Factfulness, he says, humans aren't very good at dealing with big numbers. So in cloud, you're almost always dealing with giant numbers. And so he said, whenever somebody gives you a big number to consider, ask for another number to compare it to. And I always think about that whenever somebody says, this is what we're going to spend on this thing. And I always want to say, and we're going to compare that to what? that was less than what we were spending before? Is it more than what we were spending before? Is it that much per this many transactions or this many customers that we're supporting? What is it that the unit economic is coming down to? And we can often define those things really early on, even if they're estimates, even if they're just like, this is what we want to achieve with this new product launch. So that I can say, I'm shooting for this unit economic in the end game, and I can do that even way up front when I'm in ideation about a product or when I'm in product design. Having that as a goal or as a thing you can track throughout is a really important thing to do. Yeah.
So start doing this very early.
Start doing it as early as you can. Yeah.
Yeah. Cool. Any comments, Adam? All good?
No, it's all good. Yeah.
Awesome. All right, so we are truly coming to an end here, but there are some great resources out there that I will point you towards. So the first one is, of course, the Cloud FinOps book published by O'Reilly. So that the two authors, good friends of ours, J.R. Stormont and Mike Fuller. Edition 2, I think that came out, was that earlier this year? Earlier this year. It's quite a nice, thick book, so definitely a great place to get started. Another recommendation I would have, certainly, is the FinOps.org. So that's the FinOps Foundation's website. And I will admit to actually going there quite a lot recently, which is a good sign. You've been updating your domains and capabilities quite a lot. So there's a really rich set of materials there.
And don't forget data.finops.org to take the State of FinOps survey.
There you go.
There we go.
In terms of shows, so Apptio.com, so part of Cloudability, /shows. So we have a podcast, FinOps Friday, that's presented by my colleague Hunter there. Some wonderful content to watch there. Also come to Apptio.com to our resource center. So there's a number of ebooks, guides, other things related to this topic that you might find interesting. And the last one, of course, is the AWS well-architected framework. One of the pillars is cost optimization, so very much relevant to what we were talking about today. So encourage you to also check that one out. So that's all we have for today. Thank you very much. We have about 10 minutes left, so we can take some questions if people have any.